This material is made available to you by or on behalf of the University of Melbourne under Section 113P of the Copyright Act 1968. It may be subject to copyright. For more information, visit the University Copyright website.
Hi everyone, welcome. Thanks for joining our double bill today. Got two exciting talks ahead of us. And before we do that, I'd like to acknowledge that we are on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and any Indigenous peoples here today. We acknowledge that they've always been contributing to making discoveries and sharing knowledge in these lands as we are today, and we are very privileged to build upon that legacy. So it is my great honor to introduce Professor Janaina Mourao-Miranda. She leads the Machine Learning and Neuroimaging Lab at the Computer Science Department at UCL in London. She obtained her first degree in electronic engineering at Federal University of Pará in Brazil. I won't say when. She then did a master's in artificial intelligence and a PhD in neuroscience in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. After her PhD, she did a postdoc in Munich in Germany, and then she moved to King's College in 2005. And that's where we met, so we've known each other for 20 years. That is, I don't know, that's kind of crazy. Yeah, I'm really, really pleased that you were able to come here. We were at OHBM before, so this is the after party of OHBM. Anyway, back to her expertise. She pioneered the application of machine learning methods to neuroimaging analysis, and we all very aware of how powerful these methods are to assess both cognitive and clinical neuroscience questions. She was awarded a Wellcome Trust Research Career Development Fellowship to set her own lab at UCL, and then another Wellcome Trust Senior Research Fellowship. And the most important thing that one of the most important things, in my opinion, that she did was to develop a toolbox called, an open source toolbox called Pattern Recognition for Neuroimaging, or for short PRoNTo. This is a really amazing tool that interfaces with SPM and is very user-friendly, and yeah, really, really exciting work. So she will tell us more about today about machine learning, and I'm really looking forward to your talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Marta, for the very nice introduction, and thank you for the invitation to be here. I'm really grateful to be giving my first talk in Australia, so it's a very big honor to be here. And I'll keep an eye on the time because it's supposed to be 30 minutes, so let's hope I don't lose the time. So the title of my talk today is Machine Learning and Psychiatry, Neuroimaging, Searching for the Hidden Patterns of Mental Health. And in the talk today, I will use examples from the work I have done with clinical collaborators over the years to illustrate how the combination of machine learning and neuroimage techniques can help us to address different challenges in mental health and psychiatry, such as identifying biomarkers, improving diagnosis and prognosis of mental health disorders, and providing new tools for precision psychiatry. So I will start now with some of the motivation for the work. Mental health disorders are very common. They have an early onset. Most of the disorders start between the age of 14 and 24. They can be very disabling, and unfortunately, there is often very poor treatment outcome. And one of the big challenges, in my view, for mental health is the lack of biomarkers. Different from other medical areas, diagnosis in mental health is only based on symptoms and behaviors. And the problem with that is that many disorders have overlapping symptoms and behaviors, which makes very difficult to find the boundaries between them. Furthermore, without understanding the underlying neurobiology, it's quite difficult to develop treatments as well for these disorders. So identifying biomarkers has the potential to really change this, in my view, by improving the diagnosis and prognosis, and in particular by enabling early detection and early intervention. So if we start thinking about potential biomarkers for mental health and psychiatry, one thing we can think of is neuroimaging, potential for neuroimaging as a biomarker. Neuroimaging has been around for more than 30 years now, and they really can provide very good information about the brain structure, function, and connectivity. And if you assume that something is happening on the brain in these disorders, we should expect to find some information in this neuroimage data that could help us. And so they have a potential for biomarker. However, over the last 30 years, there has been many studies using these several neuroimage techniques in clinical neuroimage to find the differences between patient populations and health controls. But despite of many studies over 30 years, there has been very little clinical translations. So I think as neuroimagers or neuroscientists, one obvious questions for us to ask, since neuroimage has been around for so many years, is why have we found neuroimage biomarkers yet? And I think there are many reasons for that. And I won't be able to touch on all of the reasons today, but I just would like to emphasize two challenges where I think machine learning might be able to help us to overcome them. One is the fact that when we talk about mental health disorders, we're looking for very subtle and distributed differences in the brain. A situation that is very different from the most, for example, more common neurological disorders, such as dementia and Parkinson, where we expect to see some anatomical differences in the brain at specific locations. So in mental health and psychiatry disorders, we expect to see, there is a lot of evidence that these differences will be more distributed and more likely to be at the connectivity level than at the anatomical level. So they are more subtle and difficult to find, distributed and difficult to find. Another challenge, I think, is the fact that most of the studies over this last 30 years still have focused on finding group differences. Even with machine learning, which I will touch today, instead of focusing on individual prediction, which is the focus of diagnosis. And let's hope through the talk today, I will be able to illustrate how machine learning can help us to overcome these challenges. So if we're looking for neuroimage biomarkers, I would argue that the question we want to answer is, how can we identify subtle patterns in neuroimage data that's useful for psychiatry diagnosis? And if we highlight the words here, neuroimage data and psychiatry diagnosis, we can change them, replace them, and reframe this question as a much more general question, which is, how can we identify subtle patterns in complex data that's useful for prediction? And actually, this is one of the questions that machine learning tries to answer. And I won't have time, and I would love to, but I won't have time to give an introduction to machine learning. But machine learning applications for predictions are nowadays everywhere, in addition to neuroimaging analysis. And yeah, I think everyone here has been, the machine learning tries to find some patterns in a training data that then can be used for prediction in new test data. And there are examples from recommendation engines, for face recognition, object recognition. I'm pretty sure everyone here touched a machine learning algorithm before coming here to the day, at some point. So, and of course, today I'll be focusing on the application of machine learning to machine learning analysis, machine learning to neuroimage analysis. And the most common machine learning framework that has been applied to neuroimage so far has been the classification framework. So the aim of this framework, the supervised classification framework, and the aim of this framework is to classify groups. And the way it works is that we give patterns of the brain, for example, neuroimage from a group of patients and a group of controls. During the training, the algorithm, the machine learning algorithm, we find a discriminative pattern between these two groups. The outcome of the training is a predictive function, which then can be used during the testing phase for new subjects to make predictions. And there are two advantages with this approach. One is that it's a multivariate approach, so it will find subtle and distributed differences between the groups. And second, it enables single subject prediction, so having a huge potential for identifying biomarkers. And over the last 15 years already, or I think even more, perhaps 18 years, this framework has been applied to address different clinical questions in psychiatry, such as diagnosing across disease, predicting disease outcome, identifying at-risk subjects, and identifying treatment responders. And although all these studies, like over more than 15 years, I think, in my opinion, represent good evidence that there is predictive information in neuroimage data, they have been also subject to criticism. And the main criticism has been in terms of reproducibility. I will show now a figure from a researcher called Gaël Varacqua from Paris that illustrates this problem. So what people have seen is that, this figure, what it shows is a meta-analysis putting together results from many different reviews. And here they are organized by disorders, some of them, most of them, but basically what we see here is that in each plot here represents a different review of machine learning applications to neuroimage data, to clinical neuroimage data. And what we can see in one axis is the sample size. And in the other axis, we see the accuracy. And the main criticisms to these studies has been that, when the studies with small sample sizes tend to have higher accuracies than the studies with bigger sample sizes. So the problem of replicability has been found, and we can see this is a general trend in many different disorders. So, and what is happening here? So there are different possibilities to explain this trend. One is that the early studies that were with smaller sample sizes, they probably overfit because the sample sizes were very small, and that's likely to be true. But there is also a second potential explanation, is the fact that the smaller samples, they are more homogeneous. And then once we increase the samples, they become more heterogeneous, and then that might create problems for the machine learning algorithm. And I have to say that this is very counterintuitive because in general in machine learning, when the sample size increases, the accuracy of the models tend to increase. So it's a very particular situation in clinical neuroimage data and mental health in particular. So because I started my career using classifiers for many years, and after applying this classifier to many samples, I started realizing that there was a problem with this framework. And in my opinion, the main limitation with this framework is that the clinical assessment that the clinicians make with the mental health patients is very rich, so they collect a lot of information, but all this information is summarized into a single label, which is the categorical classification. And there is a lot of evidence that categorical classifications in psychiatry, they are unreliable, they have not been predictive, they don't align with findings from neuroscience, they are not predictive of treatment responses or genetics. So, and that's I'm citing here, the domain research criteria framework has been a big discussion on the limitations. They have pointed, many limitations with the categorical classification in psychiatry. So when we use the categorical psychiatry to train the machine learning models, this is our assumption. So the assumption is that the patient population and the healthy subjects come from two different distributions that are homogeneous and can be well separated. But the real world is much more like that. There's a lot of heterogeneity in the patient group and likely on the healthy control sample as well. So over the last years, my group has been trying to move away from the categorical classification, and we have been trying to develop machine learning tools and models that can still address challenges in mental health and psychiatry, but moving away from this categorical classification. So I will now give a few examples of how we can do that. One way to do that is using normative models. And normative models is quite common in medical areas where we fit a model to measures from the general or a health population, and then we can identify a subject as a patient as having abnormal measure with respect to this normative model. And from a machine learning perspective, we can frame this problem as an outlier detection problem. And the idea here, in this framework, we train the machine learning algorithm, the outlier detection algorithm, with data from a healthy or general population. And then we can apply, the output of the training is an outlier detection function, and we can apply it to new test data to predict if they are outliers or not with respect to this normative group. And this framework has already been applied to address clinical questions in psychiatry, such as identifying patients as outliers with respect to health controls, or to study heterogeneity in clinical samples. And I will show an example here of a work we did many years ago now, actually, where we test the hypothesis that the patient classification could be treated as an outlier detection problem. So in this study, we had fMRI data from a group of depressed patients and a group of health controls. And what we had here was the task in the fMRI was looking at sad face, and for each subject, we estimate a pattern of brain activation to sad faces. And this was the information we gave to the machine learning algorithm. So we trained a one-class support vector machine, which is an outlier detection algorithm, only with the data from the health controls, and we tested with the health controls, health controls not used for training, and depressed patients. And what we found was that 79% of the healthy individuals were classified as non-outliers, but about 0.5% of the patients were classified as outliers. So initially we thought, okay, this is not really working well because only half of the patients are outliers. But when we look at the patient information, they had longitudinal information, and some patients had responded to treatment and other not. And by separating the patients by this information, we found that 70% of the responder patients were classified as non-outliers, and 89% of the non-responders patients were classified as outliers. So what the algorithm was telling us was that the real outliers were the non-responders patients. We also found here a significant correlations between the outlier score and the depression score. So the more outlier they were, the higher were the depression scores. So this is one example of how we can move away from the categorical classification framework, and now show another example, which is using regression models, what also psychiatrists call the dimensional approach. So the idea here is that instead of trying to predict the category, like patients versus health controls, from the brain images, we try to predict clinical symptoms from the brain images, which might cut even across different categories. So from a machine learning perspective, this problem is a pattern regression problem. And here, in this framework, we train the machine learning algorithm with images and scores, but now they are continuous scores. And we can even include here patients and health controls if they have the clinical scores to capture the whole variability. And then the output of the training is a predictive function that can, for a group of test subjects, predict the clinical score in a continuous way. And this framework has been applied also over the last years to address clinical questions in psychiatry, such as predicting clinical symptoms from brain scans and predicting personality traits from brain scans. And I will show an example of application of this pattern recognition framework that we did a few years ago now. So in this study, we had data, was also fMRI data from distressed young subjects. And it was, in this case, it was a reward task. And for each subject, we estimate a pattern of brain activations to reward. And here we train a machine learning pattern regression algorithm called multiple kernel learning regression. And the advantage of this approach is that it can learn the contribution of different brain regions for the prediction. And here I will show the results, and to predict maniac symptoms from the pattern of recognitions to reward. And what I'm showing here in this scatter plot is the similarity. In one X, I have the actual maniac symptoms of the subjects, and in the other X, I have the predicted maniac symptoms. So a perfect model would be the diagonal, so it would predict exactly the score. So, but you can see that there is a correlation between the predicted and the real scores, and each dot here represented a subject, And in order to emphasize the transdiagnostic nature of the study, because this group of distressed young people, they had different diagnoses. So we color-code the subjects by the diagnosis. And you can see that some subjects have more than one diagnosis, and some subjects don't have any diagnosis, the ones in gray. So despite the fact that they have different diagnoses, we could capture, a relationship between patterns of brain activations to reward and the maniac symptoms. And because we use this multiple kernel learning regression that finds the regions that are most relevant for the prediction, here I'm plotting the regions that were selected by the algorithm as being relevant, and the region with the highest contribution for the prediction was the left ventral prefrontal cortex. So what we did then, in a second dependent sample, we just used the pattern of brain activations for reward within these regions, just to test if this region was really important for the prediction. And we were able to replicate the results, but just now using the patterns of brain activations within the region. So that's a way. And I think these two studies just gives us an example of how we can use machine learning to address clinical questions in psychiatry without having to rely on the categorical classification labels. But in my view, they also have limitations. One is that they still are using a single label. If we look the clinical symptoms, it's a single information and only one modality of imaging. And over the last couple of years, a number of databases, public available databases have, have become available that have multimodal imaging and lots of other informations from more than thousands of subjects. And all these databases, they really open huge opportunities for mental health and population neuroscience. But they also bring challenges is, how can we combine all these different modalities, many times very high dimensional modalities, in order to answer relevant research questions for neuroscience and mental health? And that has been the focus of my group most recently, is to answer this question. So how can we combine multiple sources of usually high dimensional information into the models? And there are two ways that we can combine this information. One is to build multiple source models for diagnosis and prognosis. And just to give a bit of nomenclature explanation here, when I talk about multiple source models, this is a more machine learning nomenclature, could be multimodal model or data fusion models. So the idea here is that we integrate different data sets, different types of data, which can be imaging or non-imaging information as input to the machine learning algorithm, and in order to do predictions. So this here is a similar framework as the regression framework supervised that I presented before, but instead of just having one image modality, we can include more image modalities. And as I said, we can also include non-image modalities. So the aim here is, again, to find the associations between these multiple data sets and the score during the training, and then making predictions for new subjects during the testing phase. And we can extend this framework to predict multiple scores at the same time using what in machine learning is called multi-output prediction. And the motivations to do that is that there is evidence that predicting multiple correlated scores at the same time is more advantageous than predicting them independently. And this framework is a supervised framework because we have the labels here, the scores, and it's a power framework because we can learn the contribution of different types of data or image modalities for the prediction. So it can help us to identify the biomarkers. And there are many different machine learning algorithms that can do that, from linear ones to non-linear ones. But in my view, the limitation of this framework is that for many relevant problems in mental health, we don't have labeled data. So for example, for finding subtypes of patients or for finding who is at risk of developing mental health disorders, we don't have labeled data to train this type of framework. So an alternative framework is combining multiple sources of information for stratification. So here, the idea is similar. We combine multiple sources of data as input to a machine learning algorithm, but here the aim is that we find some common patterns across these different sources of information that will enable us to identify subgroups of subjects, in particular subgroups of patients. And the motivation here is that these subgroups of patients will be more homogeneous and might be better target for treatment and intervention. So this is like the whole idea behind precision psychiatry stratified psychiatry and precision psychiatry. But this is, from a machine learning perspective, this is an unsupervised problem because we don't have the labels a priori. We don't know the subgroups. And actually, this is a clustering problem. But the challenge here is that clustering is a very unconstrained problem. So it's much more difficult to solve than the supervised problem. And it's very unstable. So it's first clustering, even if we just have one modality of data, clustering doesn't work well with high-dimensional data. So if now we want to combine all these different image modalities input to a clustering, it's not going to work. So what usually people do is that they select some features from each modality and then give these as input to the clustering algorithm, which can still be unstable depending on how many features you selected, how you select the features, and how you choose the algorithm. So there is a lot of problems in solving, although you might have seen similar figures because this type of figure is present in many presentations. What people usually don't say is that there is no magic on the machine learning algorithm here. It's a quite difficult problem for machine learning to solve. And in my group, we are trying to solve this problem by simplifying. And I hope now, in the next couple of slides, I will give you the intuition how we are trying to make this problem easier to solve. So we are trying to solve this problem by answering the following question. Can we use latent dimensions of cross-modality association as a parsimonious way to characterize the variations in mental health? And to make it simple and focus only on two modalities, then the question becomes, can we use latent dimensions of brain behavior associations as a parsimonious way to characterize variations in mental health? So let's hope that this slide will give you the idea behind this approach. So the idea is that if you have brain data and behavioral data from a large sample, we can find some patterns of covariation. For example, here is just a toy example. We have a network in the brain, and that co-varies with a set of behaviors. So this network, when it varies, for example, from low activity to high activity, you know, the behavior across the sample varies from I have been feeling optimistic about the future to I thought there was nothing good to me in the future. So this is a pattern of covariation across the sample. So once we find this pattern of covariation, you can see that it's capturing something related to depression. So this is a latent dimension as a pattern of covariation, which we can call a latent dimension of brain behavior association related to depression. Once we find this, we can compute the scores for each subject in our sample that express how much they show us how much they are expressing this association, and we can average these scores since they are correlated by construction, and we create a brain behavior latent dimension or scores that has scores for each subject. So, and we can find more than with the scores. For example, here we look at our sample and we have again another different network that is covariating with a different set of behaviors. Now, when there is low activity in this network, we have symptoms or behaviors that goes from I had the best family in the world, and high activity in this network goes with I attach little importance to having closing friends. So you see there is another pattern of covariation, and this one is more linked to social aspects. So now we have a latent dimension related to social aspects, and again we can compute the brain behavior score that is social related. And here I'm just giving an example that could be a pattern of activity, but this could be a pattern of connectivity or even a structural image. So we have to find just this pattern of covariations between the brain data and the behavioral data. So once we find these, then we can combine these latent dimensions to create a brain behavior latent space. And so we found, just in this toy example, we found these two latent dimensions. One was capturing depression aspects in the sample, and the other was capturing social aspects of the sample. And as I said, each subject has a score on these two dimensions. So we can plot our sample in this latent dimension. And now we can use this. So this latent space is really capture information about, summarizing the two modalities and capture variations in mental health from normal to abnormal, and we can use this latent space, for example, to find subgroups of subjects based on their scores and the two dimensions. And here, if we just look at the depression-related dimension, we can use it as a diagnostic approach. We could also use it potentially to find the subjects at risk of developing because their score is becoming higher in a specific latent dimension. So that's the idea. So by finding these latent dimensions, we can simplify the problem instead of using the original very high dimensional data. And then the question becomes how we find these latent dimensions. So there are different models that find these latent dimensions of associations. I will just here show an example of a few of them. So these approaches, multivariate approaches such as the sparse partial least square and regularized canonical correlation analysis can find these latent dimensions of associations between brain and behavior. And just for people who might be familiar with partial least square and canonical correlation analysis, the SPLS and regularized CCA are just extensions of these traditional statistical methods, but now embedded in the machine learning framework with regularization, which makes them applicable to very high dimensional data. Even though PLS and CCA cannot be applied to very high dimensional data, the regularized versions can. Even if you have more features than samples, we can apply these machine learning versions, regularized versions of these approaches. And there are also, we've been more recently working with Bayesian approaches to find these latent dimensions. So there are also probabilistic methods that can find these latent dimensions, and even between more than two data types, because here we just have brain behavior. But let's just go here, how these methods work. So they work by finding pairs of weight vectors, one for each data type, such that when we project the brain data onto the behavior weights, we compute behavior scores, and then we project the behavioral data onto the behavior weights. We can compute these behavior scores, and the brain and the behavior scores are our latent dimensions. And CCA find these vectors to maximize the correlation between these scores, and PLS find these weights to maximize the covariance between these two latent dimensions of the score. So once we find them, we can then plot this, our sample with the brain behavior scores, and you can see how this association is varying across the sample. So, but as I said, this is just an example. There are many different approaches that can find these latent dimensions of association. And I just want to show as the final example of the talks that we recently applied this approach to identify latent dimensions of brain psychosocial associations in a large population of healthy adolescents. And then here I'm calling it brain psychosocial associations instead of brain behavior associations, because we included much more information in the models, like we include behavioral, clinical, cognitive, and social demographic information. And our question is, can we find these latent dimensions of related to mental health, particularly in adolescents? To answer this question, we use a sample from the ABCD study. Some of you might be familiar with. So this is the largest long-term study of brain development and child health in US. It has more than 11,000 children. And their age at time point 0 when the study started was they were around 9 to 10 years old. And the kids will be followed up for at least 10 years. And just to explain the data we used here, so the sample size was after some cleaning of the data. We had still more than 11,000 children. So the brain data, we used voxel-wise structural MRI, so gray matter density information. So we used whole brain voxels, so the number of features we had was quite high, so more than 100,000 of voxels on the brain side. And the psychosocial data, we had items from 29 questionnaires that evaluated mental health, cognitive performance, behavior domains, and social demographics. So we had lots of variables. And that's what I was trying to say before, that these machine learning versions or these regularized versions of CCA and PLS, they really can work with this very high dimensional data. Even though the number of voxels is higher than the number of 11,000 of subjects. So there were, before our study, some similar type of analysis of the ABC data, but using ROIs, and they hadn't found any latent dimensions related to mental health. So the question we had is, by using voxel-wise, we'll be able to find latent dimensions now capturing psychopathology in this, because this is a healthy sample. They are still very early on. So, and this was a recent study where we showed that by using the sparse partial least square, we were able to identify 6 latent dimensions of brain psychosocial associations in the ABCD sample, and 4 of them were related to mental health, like capturing aspects. One was capturing aspects related to overeating, another related to ADHD symptoms, another related to anorexia internalization, and one related to oppositional symptoms. And we also found other latent dimensions capture more cognitive associations with IQ and income and being bilingual. And I won't have time to go into the detail, happy to answer questions later, but I think this study is an example of how we can find these latent dimensions, but use this approach to find the latent dimensions of mental health, but link it to underlying neurobiology. Because latent dimensions of mental health have been long found with approaches such as factor analysis, but just using the symptoms. So now we are finding these latent dimensions, combine the symptoms, but also with the brain. So we find then link it to an underlying neurobiology, which I think is important. And also here is an example where we can illustrate the importance of, we have an example, the importance of adding the brain to this type of latent variable models to find the mental health symptoms, because usually when latent variable models such as factor analysis are applied to only to the symptoms, ADHD symptoms tend to appear together with the oppositional symptoms in a single factor, in a single latent dimensions. And here, by including the brain, they appear into two different latent dimensions. So this, by including the brain, we might help us to separate these mental health dimensions in a more fine, refined way. And I want to just finishing with, I don't know if I have much time to show these results, but I have just one more slide after that one. I don't know, it's okay? I don't know if one more slide. Yeah, this is a closing slide after this. So it's just, we also compared our analysis with using parcellation. So would we find the same results if we use parcellation, those ROIs using different types, anatomic and network parcellation? And if we use the parcellation instead of the voxel-wise, we find less modes, and the brain psychosocial correlation, out-of-sample correlation will be lower than using the voxel-wise information. And then we had the question if different resolutions find the same latent dimension, and yes, this is true for the first couple of latent dimensions. Doesn't make a big difference if you use ROIs or voxel-wise, but we find more latent dimensions by using the voxel-wise data. And I just want to finish with a bit of a vision where I expect this to lead us. So I think if we apply this type of approach to large data sets with lots of different sources of information and potentially different types of patients, I expect us to find these multiple latent dimensions related to mental health. And the idea is that we can combine them. And I expect that there will be an area in this space where health people will be lying. And then, if you start scoring high on these latent dimensions of mental health, you might be at risk and then become a patient. So that's just the vision. And I want to finish by acknowledging my colleagues and collaborators, and happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Janaina. That was really great and so clear as well. So we've got time for maybe a couple of questions. Natalia, and then...
Thank you very much for probably the most accessible introduction to machine learning. I just wanted to ask a question. With these big models, often you get parameters of subgrouping based on some obvious but not potentially very relevant parameter. For example, in one of the talks in the session with OHB and cloud sharing, there was a chronotype on the brain, association subgroup, but they were mostly loaded on gender or sex. And here I noticed bilingualism being a factor. However, if you think about it, it's very unlikely that just speaking a different language itself is very relevant to mental health. It's rather reflecting some socioeconomic basis that is probably not a direct relevance, but a factor. So I just wanted to understand what is a good way to move forward from identifying important factors that help dissociate groups, but are not exactly necessarily 100% relevant to the question.
That's a very good question. I think it depends on what you put in the model. Usually we put age and gender, and many times we do find a factor that there will be a factor for age and gender. It was not the case here because I think it's quite balanced and they have about all the same age. But we usually, if I would show other results, we cap. And we have this discussion, we can regress out the age, but usually it's like we decide to keep, and because there is a, it's age it will modulate the other effect. We have depression and age and depression in gender. We know that, and we prefer to see that on the loadings, that gender plays an effect with other things, than not seeing it or left. But yeah, it's true. And depending on the way, it's usually we find, if you use structural data, we find a latent dimension related to age and gender. That will be there. But then if you use particularly the sparse PLS, because it's sparse, it tends to separate things. So there will be one age and gender, and then there will be some related to other aspects. And it depends on what you put in them. If you put cognition, you'll find things related to cognition. If you put mental health, so maybe there is a need. We didn't do that, but I think it's a good idea to think a little bit about what you put in the models. But the fact that you don't put it doesn't mean it's not going to influence your model, because you might not put the age and gender, or because you don't want to find something aligned with age and gender, but then it might be aligned with age and gender anyway. So that's why we prefer to put the things explicitly.
Thanks for your talk. I had a question, or two questions. First, I think in the middle of the talk you were presenting some input features which include the tractogram and some functional networks.
Yes.
I think by the end of the talk we were just looking at structural data. So it'd be good to know if you left those other derived data behind at some point. What was the value of them? Or
No, it was just because this was a proof of concept study. We are just now had one more recent study where we combined 10 different modalities. It's just not published yet, and we are writing this up. And I just want to keep it simple, but yes, you can combine. We started with 2 because it's easy, brain and psychosocial, but more recently we had brain, like structural, resting state, psychosocial, blood test, etc., etc., and then we can find these latent dimensions that capture associations across all these. And more recently, we want to find these probabilistic models, I was saying, the group factor analysis that finds associations across subsets of the modalities, because maybe one factor is brain and behavior, another factor is brain and genetic and environment, I don't know, and then another, you don't want, that's one limitation of these models here, is that they will find only latent dimensions that capture association across everything. So more recently, what we've been doing is trying to use models that capture associations across subsets of the modalities, because once you go more than 2, you want to have, I don't know if it makes sense, but you don't want to find just latent dimensions to capture association across everything. But yeah, we are going there at the moment. But I just didn't have, very nice results to present, organized.
Yeah, no, I guess the question was, sorry, something else, but yeah, if those other modalities, it seemed as if they were valuable and contributing to our models. The other thing, if you don't
there's another
You want to maybe...
question, or did you want to?
No, maybe while she, I can try to answer.
Okay, all right, then that's fine.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
No, but while she changes, you can ask the question.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, the other thing was just about the interpretability of some of those results. I know that the interpretability is a big issue. I think I noticed B1 being super important for overreading there in the end, and that was confusing.
Which one?
The primary visual cortex.
Yeah, that's a very good. We tried. We had a lot of discussion if this was an artifact.
Yes.
And we repeated the analysis so many times because we thought, okay, that's probably fat in the back of the head. And we did different kinds of pre-process. I think we spent almost a year because we thought that was an artifact. And actually then there was other reference, other people seeing the same thing, that overeating has some effect on the visual area. I don't know how to explain it. But yeah, I'm now convinced that is a view. If it's somehow there is this effect there. But yeah, it was not only. There are other references. At the time, some references were came. And here I present results with linear models only. That's my group. We have been using very little non-linear, like deep learning, because then is where the problem of interpretation becomes more difficult. But yeah, that's why we've been trying to, as much as possible, limit, if we can, use linear models for interpretation. I think I'll pass it on.
Yeah.
And I'm happy to answer questions later as well.
Let's thank Janaina again for her talk.
Hi everyone. For those that don't know me, I'm Sarah Knight and I'm a senior lecturer in the school and a paediatric neuropsychologist by background. And today I'm absolutely delighted to present Shannon Scratch on behalf of the BAM Hub. Shannon is one of my old friends and colleagues, and as we were sitting down here today, she trained here, and I think one of her first ever lectures
First one.
was in this lecture theatre by Professor Michael Sailing. So it's so lovely to have you back. So just to let you know a little bit about Shannon, she is a senior clinician scientist at Bloorview Kids Rehabilitation Hospital in Canada, and also an associate professor at the University of Toronto. She's a practicing clinical neuropsychologist, and she leads the novel lab over there, and she's actually internationally renowned for her work in pediatric acquired brain injury research, and really leading the way in co-design methodologies. So thanks, Shannon.
Thank you. I know it's a bit of a full circle moment being back here. I've missed Melbourne a lot, so it's really nice to be back and full of coffee and good food and good friends, which is the way to be. So I am a clinician scientist, a neuropsychologist by training, and that's the lens that I bring to pretty much all the work that I do. In my lab, I'm really proud of it. It's a bit of a special place. We kind of do a bunch of different things. Some of the projects we have are a bit observational in nature. We combine neuropsychology with different types of imaging. But the other work we do is very grassroots. It's very clinically relevant. So I'll be in clinic and I'll hear from families, I wish we had this. And then we go away and we get to make it. Or I hear from clinicians the same thing. And so what we're trying to do is make that integration between clinic and research really real. And the best way to do that is with some of the implementation science methods that are out. So that's what I'm going to kind of cover today a little bit, is that kind of clinically oriented way to kind of think and conceptualize. Obviously, I have to do that in an interdisciplinary setting. So I can only bring so much, and I work with lots of great people to help round out my skills in that way. So that's kind of what I'm gonna hit on a little bit today, is one of the programs that we started, and how we actually systematically work through some of these steps to show that this might have value in an implementation context. So Toronto is actually really big now. It's almost 7 million people, and it's GTA, which is wild to me. I left and it was 4, I came back and it exploded. And we are on the land of the Seneca and Huron-Wendat peoples. And Holland Bloorview is the largest pediatric rehab hospital in Canada. So we filter in from many people across the province, but it's a lovely place over a ravine, and it's really nice to work there. Has one of the largest pediatric acquired brain injury services in the country. And so that's kind of the group that I'm going to focus on a little bit today. Just an acknowledgement that if you see anything that's a pretty slide, I didn't make it. I have a wonderful lab with great grad students and staff members who help with all the work that we do, and I'm kind of the representative of some of the program largely. So just wanted to acknowledge all the great people that we work with. So let's start off with a little bit of something that I heard in clinic, and then I'm going to walk you through what we built to address that a little. So as a clinician scientist, like I was saying, I have the opportunity to hear right from the ground what people are experiencing, some of their frustrations, some of their wishes. And in this context, I was working with a family, and they said something around the line of, if navigating the education system is as hard for me, what's it like for other people? And this parent themselves was also an educator. So they were struggling to find a way to help their child back to school. Clinicians feel like they have the same conversations with families over and over again. This isn't unique to this population, but this is something that we hear, right? I feel like every time I'm going back to school and we're starting again for every patient I have, for every person that I'm working with. And this kind of sparked a little bit of an idea for me. All right, what are we going to do to address this, which seems like a pretty simple problem, but actually involves lots of systems and lots of people in it. So I think for the next couple minutes, what I'm going to do is walk you through a design process of how we built something and why we built it and how we tested it. And that is our Teach ABI program. And I'll show you what that is here in a little second. So in the lab, we kind of use different models. We integrate different implementation science models. We borrow from engineering science. We borrow from a whole bunch of design science to kind of think of a way to test and create solutions based on the problems that we hear. So I guess the first stage that we often think about is turning a spark into an idea. So it's great that you hear something, but is it an idea? Or what is the idea? How do we operationalize that idea that's there? How do we turn that idea into a solution? What do we need to grow and build? How do we evaluate it? How do we build evidence around it? And then can it be adapted later? So these are different design steps that we kind of go through, and we have many different programs now, probably 5 or 6, that sort of have followed this design wheel and trajectory as we bounce back and forth. Just as a little note, whenever you're designing something, if this looks very good, you bounce back and forth between the steps all the time. So there's ways to go forward and backwards when you're building and designing things, especially for clinical need and when you're working with people. So for people that don't know much about acquired brain injury, I'm not going to spend a long time defining what it is, but I just wanted to give you some context around the education challenge that's there. So what we have is a group of kids that have had a brain injury, whether that's a traumatic brain injury, a concussion, or something like more like a pediatric stroke. But what we know across the world is that we know educators themselves feel very underprepared to support these kids back to school. And school is a kid's job. We have to get them back into that context, right? But the classroom teachers themselves are really unsure and unaware of how to actually support them after they've had an injury. So we have a lot of challenges back to school for kids. They struggle in that environment. It's a really demanding one, whether it's cognitively or based on noise alone. It's quite a demanding environment. But if teachers are taught about acquired brain injury, kids do better. So if the teachers are feeling more confident, the kids are better in the classroom and their outcomes are better. Makes sense? And if we can build that supportive school environment, it can help with that successful school reintegration. So there is some findings that if we can address this gap a little bit, if we can figure out a way to do it, we can actually improve, hopefully, kids' outcome in the school situation by helping to raise awareness, knowledge, whatever it might be for the educators themselves. So knowing that this was a gap, we wanted to potentially address this. So that spark, that idea that can we get in there at that moment, can we turn that into an idea? So there's a couple ways that you can do this. People like to call these different scans, right, of the situation. So what we wanted to do was a broad one across the literature and say, what else is out there already? We are not lacking educational resources in the world that we're in. There are pamphlets on everything. The internet is full of things. But what is actually out there that an educator might use? Does something already exist that we should be figuring out how to implement? So we actually hired a teacher and said, hit the internet. Like, just Google stuff. See what you can find. We'll give you a bunch of hours and see what you can get back. So what we wanted to do was a bit of like a live scan instead of us doing things completely methodologically. Like, what are you actually finding? So this person spent hours scouring for different resources that might be appropriate for a teacher. And despite all of it, there was not much that was evidence-based, nothing that kind of hit a need to help a student return to school. We also did a needs assessment before the end of the world and the pandemic. We brought in people, about 50 or 60 people came into the hospital, and we did a needs assessment. So we said, if we're going to build you something for you to use in the classroom, what do you want? What should it look like? And I say often that they ask me to fix the education system, which I cannot do. But what they did talk to us about was this kind of need for initial learning about what ABI is and how they can help. Like, what skills do I need to actually make this real for the children that are in front of me? What was beautiful from meeting with these teachers is that they were all desperate to help. Teachers are amazing, and I love them so much. They're very clever, they're very curious, but they were really down on themselves about their own skills and their own learning. So it was interesting to see that gap in their own confidence there about how to support people in the classroom. So we kind of did this needs assessment. So if we're going to build you something, what do we build, and is there already something out there? Turns out no. So we wanted to make that into a bit of a solution. There are so many different implementation science models that you can use to actually create something. Ours fell with the knowledge to action cycle, if you're an implementation science person in the audience. And we kind of followed a few steps to create something that was meaningful. Instead of it just being a kind of PowerPoint like this boring one I'm sending you, how do we actually make something that's meaningful for the person? And we used a case-based learning approach through that with kind of the experience of following somebody through their journey. We created wireframes. We worked with teachers. This is actually built by teachers for teachers. And what we wanted to do was come up with a clear set of learning objectives. So you can't build something until you know what it is that you're defining it. And so for our program, coming up with this one slide took months. What are we trying to get across? Does this match what the clinicians want? Does it match what the families want? Does it match what an actual educator would like if we're going to give you something to learn from? So we created a bit of a program base for that. From there, we built out our program. And this is a bit of a walkthrough. Hopefully the volume will work. I'm doing this pretty quickly, guys, too, because I know that we got a time crunch here.
TJBI is a self-directed online professional development module for educators that introduces acquired brain injury causes and outcomes and provides strategies for supporting students with ABI in the classroom. TJBI uses a case study design, following a teacher who learns to support one of his students with ABI. The module is divided into 2 parts. Part 1 provides an overview of ABI and the presentation of a student with ABI in the classroom. And Part 2 discusses the ways to support a student with an ABI by providing classroom strategies for cognitive, emotional, physical, communication, and behavioral outcomes. The module has different features to engage educators and offer further learning opportunities, including knowledge check questions, downloadable tip sheets that summarize module information, links to external resources that dive deeper into concepts discussed in the module, and embedded videos from a neuropsychologist, school principal, and people with lived experience of ABI.
Okay. So I don't think that this is a particularly novel thing. We have lots of e-learning things in the world, right? But what we wanted to do was make it relevant to the people that were actually going to be using it. Often, what we've done is create materials and just put them on a website and say, hopefully this helps. But what we've lacked is that genuine curiosity of what did you build? Did it actually matter for the people so they can implement it a little bit more effectively in their environment? Sorry, went the wrong way.
TJB.
So after we build something, you need to test it. So you need to make sure it's usable for people, and you need to iterate through these different stages to change whatever program you've developed. So we did some usability testing here early on. And we were looking at satisfaction, usability with this type of program. We did multi-method, so there were some qualitative pieces, some quantitative pieces, and we used a system usability scale. If somebody opens up tech and it doesn't work, they will never learn anything from it. So is this usable? And we've created a priori benchmarks. So you have to test this kind of stuff. And it made that. So I think when you work with people early on and you integrate their views and their preferences into the things that you're creating and you take your time at the front end, this step should be fairly easy. And we saw that. So when we worked with teachers to build the content that they wanted, they found that it was quite satisfactory. We were able to hit some usability benchmarks that we put out. So whatever we were achieving was hitting some initial evaluation of the solution at the beginning. So from that, you want to build out some evidence as a next stage. Okay, great, we created something. Does it actually work though? Does it actually change knowledge? Because often, again, something simple, even as a program, we never test it on the back end, and we assume it changes knowledge, and it doesn't in the end. So we ran a study with 50 different educators. They came in before, did a series of questionnaires for us, immediately post the program they did, and at 2 months. And we had a 100% retention rate, which is like going to be the only time in my life that we actually achieved that in reality, which was nice. And what we found is that we did have a big change in knowledge. We had a big change in self-efficacy as well, from pre to post, and it was maintained at 2 months. So there was something there about just doing a little bit of a program that was specialized to their question, that they were able to maintain their knowledge. This is going to be published in JINS. It's coming out in the next hopefully next couple months, where we kind of show our evidence build. We also had a bunch of qualitative interviews that were done for this group as well, about 30 people, and then we're writing up that data too at the moment. So the next stage has been, great, we created this thing, maybe we have some knowledge, maybe we have some uptake, maybe people are feeling better to move these kids back into the classroom, but how do we actually implement something like this? So there are a couple new trial designs that people are using for this question. They're called effectiveness implementation trial designs. So you're building out the rest of your effectiveness data at the same time that you're testing implementation pathways. And so we just got funded to do this directly into schools. So we're going in, we're meeting with the principals, we're building out individualized implementation pathways per school, and then we're testing whether or not we're actually changing knowledge. So the good thing here is maybe in the end, the control is just as good as our program. That's okay. We've already built out the implementation pathway in order for any kind of education to get in for these teachers about pediatric ABI. So you're testing both things simultaneously and iterating as you go. They're very challenging trials to design, especially if you have a randomized control component to it like we do here. So it's going to take a few years to work through both healthcare settings and education settings to make sure that we can get our ethics in line. Took a year itself. But we're starting to go in, and we just recruited our first 2 schools for this type of trial. So we're doing an implementation effectiveness trial. The last thing I want to touch on is sometimes you have an idea, and then other people like your idea, or they want to adapt it to different contexts. So since then, we had lots of people say, what about high school students? So now we've built out the program similar ways for a high school context, which is obviously very different than elementary. The lovely Sarah thought, what about Australia? We have a very similar problem here. How do we do that? So we've now adapted that. Marnie Drake has done that as part of her PhD, and she's round in the corner on that work to see if we can bring something to Australia and how do we implement it here when it was built overseas. And now we have some other ongoing things. So on the unit at the hospital, they said, why are you just giving it to the schools? Give it to the hospital. So we started to implement on the hospital setting as well. So we're using it as a discharge tool there and doing some testing there with an implementation pathway. And part of that study, every caregiver said, I need something. I need some upskill, I need some advocacy. And so we have a whole new program that's being built that's designed for caregivers to help their knowledge and improve their ability to advocate for their student in the education system. So working the other way around. So it's amazing, I think, what happens when you systematically build something to see how many things come from that. So it's a bit of the pipeline of what one of our projects is like to build. Again, we have about 5 or 6. This is probably your simplest one. How many things you need to do to systematically do this type of work properly. You can't just implement because you say you want to. You have to think about the context and the people up front right from the time of idea conception. So I burned through that pretty quick, because I know we're done lunch, but thank you so much. If you have questions, I'm happy to answer anything. You can always send me an email, and I'm always happy to answer anything from Melbourne Uni. Yeah,
I know it sounds complicated, but could you explain the RCT design? It sounds really good.
Yes, that design was really, fingers crossed. Okay, this is the theoretical design of it. So what we have done is after we got through all the ethics procedures of schools, which is challenging, we approach a principal and they say, yep, I'm good to go, come on into the school. And we chat to them. How would you implement something like this in your school? Principals are kind of in charge of their own universe, their own school, right? So we build out the implementation pathways for their school. Then once they decide what that will look like, some principals are saying something like, we want to do it in the couple days leading up to term starting. Teachers have PD days, so we're going to put those in there, whatever it might be for the school. Then we randomize the teachers into 2 groups. So either they'll get our program or they'll get the educational resources alone. So we give them basically a handout and say, here you go, same amount of time, do your thing. And then we're going to test whether or not there's any difference between doing our program versus educational resources. They will have access to the program at the end, though. So after this is all done and they fill out their post, they'll be able to access the program if they'd like it. That's theoretically how it should work. The whole randomization is actually pretty challenging, right? Because we're off-site, we're not in the school. So how do we actually randomize that way? We've done a numbering system in order to do that, using REDCap. To create that kind of randomization procedure. We'll see. These types of trials haven't been done in a school before. So I actually think our method alone, writing that protocol, might be helpful to other people so that they can come through and tell me I did it wrong. That's totally fine, but I want to be kind of open about how to even approach. Because we're not very good at figuring out how to do health-based research in an education setting with this type of design in it. So fingers crossed it'll work. I'll tell you in a year if we're getting anywhere. Yeah.
Can I ask ask you a quick question?
Sure.
I don't know we've talked about this before, but point of care versus implementing school-wide, what do you think is better? Because do you think every teacher needs to know about acquired brain injury, or?
Yeah, I think so. In Ontario, which is the province we're in, there is a legal mandate to learn about at least concussion. We have a law now, so yes, I think that particular setting that could be useful. I still think point of care is going to be more relevant, but what would be really nice, basically the main message of our module or program, is that teachers already have a lot of skills. Use the skills you have for the people that are in front of you. Because I think what people are worried about is that they have to go away and learn a whole heap of other things. But what we're trying to teach people is that you have so many things there, let's apply them towards this population. So I think that message is really important because they know a lot of this already. So many teachers, when you work with them clinically, they're always worried they're gonna make somebody worse. What if I push them? I'm going to make their brain injury worse. Like there's just that kind of lack of understanding. So I think that message alone would help them if they end up working with someone. Point of care, I think, will be more relevant. Yeah.
Okay, well, we might finish. Thank you everyone for coming, and thank you, Shannon, so
No
much
worries.
for presenting, and what a great couple of presentations today. So
Thanks so much, everybody. Enjoy the sunny day, sunny winter day.